Hello, and welcome to Book Circle Presents An Ever-Mounted Cavalry. I'm Earl Weinberg. Our heroine Ivy has been introduced to Miss Blackholt's patient, Brother Eugene, a monk who's always found riding on a horse. In the following days, a routine developed based on Ivy's first day. In the morning, she and Brother Eugene would potter around the woods or the garden or the village together after her breakfast and before his. Brother Eugene and Blanco were a great success with the other children, and Ivy found she was envied. During the day, she read books from Miss Blackholt's extensive library, fetched books for Brother Eugene, who never went in the house, and on a couple of occasions sat under a tree and listened to him read to her, translating as he went from a book of French folk tales, all the while sitting on Blanco, who parked out with his legs slightly spread and gazed intently into the distance as if he were listening carefully to the book. Ivy asked to hear a bit in the original French, and Brother Eugene reeled off some with complete facility. He went on to explain that he had grown up on a farm in France. "You don't sound French a bit," she said, "when you're not reading it." "Well, thank you. I worked at it as a boy. I'm pretty much French and English in equal parts." He smiled. "You could call me Eugène just as well as Eugene, if you liked." The courier, Corporal Limney, came around most days to pick up a report. Ivy learned to note the sound of his motorcycle and made herself scarce. Things changed a bit when school started, but not much. The school only held half-days because of the crowding from the evacuees. There were only 2 teachers, and even though Ivy had the one for the older children, the classes were still quite young for her. She did much more studying for free at Miss Blackholt's house. One day she came back from her brief school to hear Miss Blackholt's voice coming from the garden between the house and the garage. Following the sound, she saw her hostess seated on the kitchen chair next to the beehives. She wore her hair in a braided crown again and scarves of yellow and brown. In her lap lay a wide piece of white cloth. A tablecloth? A very grand one, if so. The white was dazzling and slick-looking, like the scarf Brother Eugene wore all the time. There was embroidery on it, too. Miss Blackholt was holding it up, running it slowly through her fingers, and talking to herself. "Certainly I've read through his notes at least 3 times, but it's very complicated. Those notes are more of a treatise, 5 chapters, each one building on the last. And then I have to— Oh, hello, Ivy." "Hello, miss. I didn't mean to interrupt." Miss Blackholt gazed at her thoughtfully, then smiled and recited, "Bees, bees, hark to your bees, hide from your neighbors as much as you please, but all that has happened to us you must tell, or else we will give you no honey to sell. A maiden in her glory upon her wedding day must tell her the bees her story, or else they'll fly away. Fly away, die away, dwindle down and leave you, but if you don't deceive your bees will not deceive you." That's Kipling. But he wrote about a real custom, an old one, talking to the bees. I'm too busy to have pets, but the bees are someone, something to talk to, a sounding board. Ivy nodded. "What about?" she asked. "Embroidery," Miss Blackholt answered promptly. "I do have to have some hobby. This one was sent me by my uncle. I'm studying it, trying to figure out the technique." She spread a section out on her lap for Ivy to examine. Creamy stitchwork coiled over the stark shining white in paisley patterns and Celtic knots. Here and there the stitches held little glassy or silvery beads. "It's very pretty," Ivy started to say when a bee landed on it, buzzing straight past her face as it came in. She jerked back. "Don't worry," said Miss Blackholt hastily. Then, "It won't sting," she added in a flat, forceful tone that seemed to imply, "Don't you dare." "I suppose not," said Ivy, trying to sound composed. "They can't be eager to sting, I should think, since it kills them." She was showing off her natural history reading. "It kills workers," Miss Blackholt specified, "but not queens, and of course drones can't sting at all." "Which one is this?" "Hard to say." They both watched the bee, which was engrossed with a little labyrinth of stitches with silvery beads at the center. Then it made a short aerial hop to a similar labyrinth, then a third. "Does it think those are flowers?" asked Ivy. "I doubt it." The two of them watched the bee inspect the stitchery, then flit off and out of sight. Miss Blackholt ran her forefinger over the spots the bee had inspected. Ivy brought up a new subject. "Did you know Brother Eugene can read Latin?" Miss Blackholt looked up. "Yes. Has he been translating Latin to you along with French?" "Not yet, but he asked me to ask you if you had a book by, the name was like Oval." "Ovid?" "That was it. Metamorphoses, like butterflies do, and bees, come to think of it." Miss Blackholt glanced toward the woods, where Brother Eugene was presumably riding. "Yes, that would interest him. I think there's a copy in the bookcase by the fireplace, the one on the left." "Thank you. I'll leave it on his bed. Is he ever going to come into the house?" "I hope so." After that, the daily routine included Miss Blackholt working on her embroidery out in the yard next to the hives, or by the fireplace after supper. She had said it was a hobby, but she worked with ferocious concentration and sometimes pausing to stare into the fabric or off into the distance. On the other hand, many people were very serious about their hobbies. The end of the daily routine was going up to bed with a cup of herbal tea and one or two books. It was the same tea Miss Blackholt had given her on her first night. Ivy would dump it out the window, then curl up with the books. She kept an ear cocked to the conversation coming up from downstairs. If it was good, she would go to the top of the stairs, sit on the floor, and listen. Lieutenant Fletcher generally dropped by in the evenings after spending the day buzzing about on errands for Miss Blackholt. Lieutenant Blackholt, Ivy reminded herself. In the evening, he and Miss Blackholt would discuss the day's errands, make plans for the next day, listen to the wireless, and gossip. At least, Ivy supposed so. They used 3 different languages, English, French, and what Ivy supposed was Channel Island French. They switched around quite freely. One night, after listening to a news story about a speech given by King George, Miss Blackholt said in a wistful tone, "I wonder what would have happened if the king hadn't died." Up the stairs, Ivy frowned, puzzled. According to the news, the king was quite alive and giving speeches. Fletcher sighed loudly and impatiently. "Oh, what if? There are endless possibilities. He might have died the next day falling off a cliff. Well, I suppose the likeliest result is that we would have been spared the succession crisis, but we'd still be looking for Thessalonians under every bed. Maybe Hugh wouldn't have founded the cavalry. You'd probably still be doing the same work, though." "That's all right," Miss Blackholt returned. "It's very interesting work." "So's mine. Practice went well today. I could walk without thinking about it. Very convenient having the woods to bumble about in. You're sure the locals don't go in?" "The adults don't. There's no game bigger than squirrels. They hunted out the rabbits generations ago, I suppose. When the weather gets warmer, children will lark about in it, and lovers looking for private walks together." Fletcher laughed. "Quel interesting ye dever voir laid ici." "What interesting things you must see situated here." Miss Blackholt laughed back and answered in the same other French. They continued it. Ivy waited in hopes of more English, but it never came. Fletcher went back to his room at the pub, and Ivy went back to bed, wondering what king was dead and what Thessalonians were. One evening, the routine changed. Ivy was in the side garden, sitting next to the hives, a deliberate exercise in courage, reading The Life of the Bee, naturally, when Miss Blackholt and Lieutenant Fletcher burst out of the garage, eyes shining. Miss Blackholt smiled. Fletcher grinned. "Come, Ivy," Miss Blackholt directed. "We're going to set the table for supper. For 4. Brother Eugene will be joining us." Ivy rose immediately and followed the adults in. "Without Blanco?" she asked, just to be sure. They both laughed, rather loudly. "Without Blanco," Miss Blackholt agreed. "Blanco must make his own arrangements tonight," said Fletcher. In a few minutes, the kitchen table was set, and Ivy stood at the door watching Fletcher and Miss Blackgold help Brother Eugene walk from the garage to the house. He seemed to need help with balance more than with weak legs. His smile broadened as he came to the door. "I'm very happy to join you at supper, Ivy," he said with playful formality. She smiled back. Fletcher popped through ahead of Brother Eugene and presented him with a walking stick from the umbrella stand. The monk looked about the front room, which he had not seen before. "Very nice," he murmured. Helped by Fletcher and the walking stick, he made his way to the kitchen table. He sat down heavily, then grinned at Ivy. "Made it." Miss Blackgold, who'd been trailing, watched Brother Eugene like a hawk, gave a small sigh of relief, and then headed for the aga. The main course was a chicken stew. Ivy liked it, but the main interest of the meal was watching Brother Eugene. He certainly liked the food, but he liked eating at a table more. "I don't know how long it's been since I've eaten in such a civilized manner," he remarked. "Have you been eating hospital food and stuff like that?" asked Ivy. "Oh, the food's been all right," Brother Eugene answered, "but to sit down with other people at a table, you don't realize you miss it until you're denied it." "Surely they could arrange something back at the base," said Fletcher. "They could, but they haven't." He shrugged, still smiling. "Little niceties like that get crowded out in war." "Thank you, Miss Blackgold," he said to his hostess. "Certainly. The food is agreeing with you?" "Oh, yes." After supper, Miss Blackgold asked Brother Eugene what he would like to do, and he asked if they might listen to music on the wireless. So they did that. This seemed to be another commonplace thing that he had missed. He was just as happy with swing as with classical, bouncing gently to the dance music while sitting in the armchair, and watched his own booted feet with interest as he did clumsy little heel-toe moves. Miss Blackgold and Fletcher stared at the monk's feet too, but Ivy kept watching his face, feeling her own smile reflecting his. She would not have been surprised if he had stood and asked her to dance with him. Then they switched back to classical, Respighi's Pines of Rome. Brother Eugene's joy changed from rollicking to serene. "I love tone poems," he remarked. "I'm afraid I'm not very musically educated," said Fletcher. "I just know that it sounds pretty." "Oh, neither am I. That's part of why I like tone poems. You can enjoy them without having to pick them apart. I know this one is about Rome, but it makes me think of places near Avignon. Ivy, after the war, when France is itself again, visit Avignon sometime in the summer or early fall." "That sounds," Ivy began, but Brother Eugene abruptly looked alarmed and shifted uneasily in the chair. He started to rise. No, he was holding himself up by his arms. Below his belt, the cloth bulged. In the back of her mind, Ivy was surprised not to hear him cry out in pain. His feet scrabbled on the floor, the boots flapping strangely. "Ivy," snapped Miss Blackgold, "go to your room." Ivy stood, but Brother Eugene barked, "Go!" as if she had not started to obey. She ran up the stairs. She looked back down, but the angle was wrong to see anything. All three of them were talking in that other French, sounding agitated but controlled. There were thudding knocking noises and the sound of furniture scraping. The door opened. She considered looking out the window to see how Brother Eugene was doing, but he had not wanted her to see whatever medical catastrophe was brewing. She let him have his privacy. Therefore, she did not see the anxious glances Miss Blackgold cast at her window, or the ones Lieutenant Fletcher sent about the evening village. And, of course, she did not see Brother Eugene. About half an hour later, Miss Blackgold came up the stairs, you might say crept up the stairs, carrying a cup of tea. It occurred to Ivy that she had not seen Miss Blackgold looking subdued before, but she did now. "Is he all right?" Ivy demanded. Miss Blackgold flinched, then said, "Yes, just disappointed. It looks so promising." She put the teacup down on the bedside table. "Did it hurt? Is he hurting now?" "No, no pain. He was even gracious about it." "I don't think pain would keep him from being gracious, not even a lot of pain." "Yes, I think you're right. But he's not in pain. She straightened and took a deep breath. He said we must simply try again. And he's right. I was pleasantly surprised when we seemed to make progress so quickly. It's just not as simple as it looked a few hours ago. What is the matter with him? Ivy burst out. Miss Blackholt gazed at Ivy in silence for a couple of seconds, and when it was over, she was back in control. If I knew exactly what was wrong, I might be able to fix it, but I'm afraid I can't even tell you the part I know. This could not be just a matter of embarrassment. Military secrets? Miss Blackholt stuttered. She tried again. Then she said simply, I can't say more, turned and left the room. Ivy stared after her. She had never heard Miss Blackholt stutter before, and it had not sounded like most stuttering, as if she had spoken too fast or changed her mind about what to say in mid-word. It had sounded like, for just that moment, Miss Blackholt actually had a speech defect, in light of which I can't say more didn't sound like I shouldn't say more, but like I am unable to say more. So Ivy went on staring. She sipped the tea. It was the usual noxious bedtime brew, but it wasn't bedtime and the tea was still noxious. She tossed it out the window as usual, lay back on the bed, and thought. She had not got very far into it when she heard the door, footsteps, and Lieutenant Fletcher's voice. She left her room for the top of the stairs and listened, but they were talking in that third language. She listened anyway on the chance that they would slip into English. They didn't, but Ivy thought there were some English words salted in. In particular, she caught digest and digestion, and maybe some bits of Latin. They sounded serious, sometimes frustrated. But they weren't yelling, weren't angry at each other. That was good. Twice that she could remember, her parents had sent her to her room so they could argue privately, as they thought. It had made her feel horrible. Both times it had been about money. Ivy remembered no details of the first time, but the second, her mother wanted to earn more money charring, and her father didn't want her to do it. And they had talked about losing the house and Mom's health, and Ivy had been frightened. She had been little then, and now felt all that was nothing, nothing, compared to your dad getting shot or your mom getting bombed. And here she was being protected by being sent away so she could be an orphan instead of getting killed. And some mysterious horror was happening to Brother Eugene, and she was crying. Ivy, called Miss Blackholt. She thought she had been silent. Un petit ting, she heard Fletcher say. Poor little thing. She nipped back to her room so as not to be caught at the top of the stairs. Now both of them were coming up. And now, without her noticing how, they were sitting on the bed with her, flanking her. I know it was upsetting, Fletcher said to her, putting an arm around her, but there's no harm done, honestly. He's not hurt, Miss Blackholt said. I promise. Ivy gulped and nodded. Miss Blackholt glanced at the empty teacup. Would you like some more tea? Ivy shook her head. Well, let's remember that most of the evening went quite well, until Brother Eugene started to melt or something. We'll try again soon. I think I know an improvement to make. Said Fletcher. He still had his arm around her, and Ivy felt him sag slightly. Between that and the tone of the she suspected Fletcher thought as little of this plan as she did. He rose and plucked a book off the nearest shelf. Here, he said, handing it to her. Poems, Ogden Nash. They're good and silly. Read some, and don't worry about Brother Eugene. Go see him tomorrow as you usually do. He'll be just as you found him this morning. They said little more, but went downstairs, talking softly now in Channel French, liberally salted with Latin. Ivy read Ogden Nash until she didn't feel upset anymore, then went to bed. She went to see Brother Eugene the next morning, not as she usually did, but an hour and a half earlier. She was up and dressed even before that, reading Ogden Nash and waiting for the sound of the garage door, which signaled that Brother Eugene was leaving for the first of his many walks for the day. "Ivy, good morning," he said as she came pelting out of the house. He looked at her concerted gaze. "Ah, don't worry, I'm all right. Blanco, too," he added as he saw her examining the horse. "Did she try the same thing on Blanco that she did on you?" Ivy demanded. Brother Eugene opened his mouth, shut it again, then said, "You needn't sound so accusatory. Miss Blackholt achieved a great deal last night, and I'm grateful for all her hard work. For a while, yes, we were all hoping it was a complete cure, but that just wasn't in the cards." He started Blanco up the hill. "That reminds me, do you play cards? Walking and reading are both excellent pastimes, but I've nothing else to do, and I know school doesn't take up much of your time." Ivy had a pleasant feeling of returning normality. A moment later, she realized Brother Eugene was probably doing this for her deliberately. The realization produced a rush of affection which made her wish all the more that he could have had his cure last night. "Fish," she answered, "and happy families, and solitaire. Your parents don't mind you playing cards? Some people have views about that, I know." "Oh, no, Dad's the one who taught me." "Well, then we can try that. Perhaps I can teach you chemin de fer if we can find enough cards." "Oh, he's bright and early." Corporal Limney was rolling over the crest of the hill toward them on his motorcycle. Wonder if he got wind of last night's events. He had. He brought his cycle to a halt a few feet away, saluted, and said, "Good morning, sir." He glanced at Ivy with, she thought, exasperation. "I'm here to pick up the report on last evening." Then he looked over Brother Eugene and Blanco at least as intently as Ivy had. "Yes, well, you must see Blackholt for the clinical details," Brother Eugene answered stiffly, "but I will tell you, we made good progress." Limney was so busy looking the monk over, it took him a couple of seconds to answer, "I see, sir. Very good, sir." More staring. "Off you go, then," said Brother Eugene, nodding in the direction of the house. More staring. Finally, "Yes, sir." He saluted and drove off. "Why does he stare at you that way?" Ivy asked when they had their privacy back. "I don't know." "You don't like it, do you? Would you?" "No, I don't even like seeing him stare at you that way." Brother Eugene sighed. "I suppose he's just very interested in my case." Their walk wasn't long. Both wanted to get back for breakfast. Coming back to the house, they saw Miss Blackholt sitting in the garden next to the hives. The white embroidery was in her lap along with a notebook. Another chair sat beside her, bearing several other books and notebooks, and Corporal Limney stood next to her, looking deflated as she spoke crisply to him. She stopped, though, as they approached. Limney saluted Miss Blackholt and said, "I'll be going then, ma'am." "Yes," she agreed. Once his motorcycle was speeding up the hill, she broke out, "Impudent knave! Wanted to know if there would be more to report later. Kept asking about problems. Were the ingredients not the right kind? Weren't they wholly fresh? Was any of the equipment old or faulty? Did I need more this and that? If he has any expertise in this field, I haven't heard about it." "We met him up the road," said Ivy. "He stared at Brother Eugene like he wanted to do a medical exam of him right there." "Perhaps he has a family interest in such cases," Brother Eugene suggested. Miss Blackholt's expression shifted from cross to thoughtful. "Possible," she admitted. She sighed and looked up. A dozen or so bees were floating about in the morning sun. "Ivy, your breakfast is ready." Ivy said, "Thank you, miss," and left. When she was out of earshot, Miss Blackholt said to Brother Eugene, "I poi no mickle gern I hald cirque latter nuit." "I cannot tell you how sorry I am about last night." Brother Eugene answered, "Ith est nain, veus experimentant, socting becom, I hald joie par ondur, I es pret a essait etan wanner thu es pret." "It's nothing. We are experimenting. Such things happen. I rejoiced for a time. I am ready to try again whenever you are ready. Merci. En cet cas, hold on idea sur la manière de l'application. Thank you. In that case, I have an idea about the manner of the application. And next time, Ivy and perhaps we may find out more about these people with a new language that Ivy never heard before. Good night.